Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome to episode 87 of our LinkedIn live stream. And you may be wondering why I'm appearing solo. Jason has the day off for good behavior. So I'm not going to be alone, though. But before we get to that, do want to encourage you to chat in any of the comment sections on the three platforms that we're TriCasting in. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We'll go to a global or a world map from time to time. And you can see now I'm in Colorado. Our producer is in Georgia, both in the United States. And then over in Europe, we've got our social team in Romania, and you'll see that England is already lit up. Reason for that is it's my pleasure to bring in my great colleague, Michael Cade, Senior Global Technologist at Veeam, now on special assignment at Caston. But keep joining us, telling us where you're from, or giving a comment as we're going through some materials. Michael, thanks so much for dropping by today.
Hey, Dave, no worries. It's nice to get
So,
in here again.
You got to show the t-shirt. I think it's going to be an appropriate. There we go.
So it's Vippy and his friends and casting K10 on a surfboard. It was the swag giveaway that we had for KubeCon NA that I didn't get to go to, but most recently we've been out to an engineering summit where I was able to gather all of that swag that people thankfully grabbed a hold of for me.
So mom and dad didn't take you, but they brought back a t-shirt is what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
That's good.
Exactly that. That was before this pandemic was allowing anyone to travel anywhere. So
Yeah. Well, you've been active in a series called 90 Day of DevOps, and it's really actually very much related to what we're going to talk about today, but maybe give a little, reminder, refresher of who you are. You've joined the live stream a few times now in the last couple of years, but tell us about your current activities and that 90 days activity.
Yeah, so pretty much on the day before, the evening before New Year's Eve, I had this idea, and I've done it before as well, more so from a personal challenge. That 1st of January to the 31st of March is exactly 90 days. It also happens to be like Q1 for a lot of companies across the board. It's just a nice 90 days, 3 months. Let's get a challenge done, whether it's fitness, whether it's health, whether it's education. And that was my choice this time, right? Is really focusing on the area of DevOps and trying to document that learning journey as we're going. So it was really quite and we're still in the middle of it, or last week of it, is basically 90 days of an hour or 2 hours a day where we're looking into the practices of DevOps. Now, that is such a broad term that I split the 90 days into 12 to 13 different sections, and each being 6 to 7 days worth, like each section was 6 to 7 days worth of focus time. So we're touching on things like Linux fundamentals. We're touching on networking fundamentals, all of the things that, as an infrastructure admin that I've been for the last 20 years, it has an element of automation. We're bringing that in there. And I've already used that a lot when it comes to virtualization and cloud-based products, but more recently moving more into the cloud native space, I really wanted to plug some of those gaps that I maybe had around things like continuous integration, continuous deployment, programming languages was another one that I really wanted to not become a developer, but have a better understanding of how the whole process from ground zero and how that comes to be an application that then gets deployed into a public realm and gets used. So then we also talk about monitoring and the monitoring stack, observability, login metrics, tracing, and then obviously data management is the last one that I finish off the challenge with.
Nice. Well, speaking of data, one of the things Jason and I like to do is use some of our research, some of our data, and do some myth busting. Right off the bat, though, as it pertains to Kubernetes, we've got two myths that love to have you take us through. The first myth is really around the notion that Kubernetes deployments, it's like server virtualization, the apps are static. I've actually, before I let you answer this one, Michael, it dawns on me that there's almost kind of myth 1A and 1B, meaning some people feel like, oh, it's static, the environment's not changing. The other, though, myth is that everything associated with containers is ephemeral. You don't need to protect anything because it's measured in a half-life of literally perhaps minutes. Neither one of those sort of boundary conditions are accurate, though, are they?
No, no, not at all. And this first one is the interesting one, is that a lot of I've always said about, like, if you do a search on your favorite search engine right now and you put containers, virtual machines, you're generally going to get at least the first full page. If I'm still right in saying this, it's all going to come up with containers versus VMs, and really that's not the comparison that we should be comparing. They're not the same thing. They're not the same. Um, they're not the same footprint. They're not delivering really the same outcome. They're more like an apples and pears type comparison. Yes, they can deliver the same application. If it's a web server, for example, yeah, absolutely, we can spin up a Linux web server, a Windows web server, whatever, as a virtual machine. We could install HTTPD, and we can install an Apache web server, and we can be up and running, and we can have that serving data. We can also equally do that from a container point of view, and we can do that equally in Kubernetes with a pod. Now, that doesn't make them the same, because ultimately, to your point, is that a pod should be ephemeral in that instance. We should be able to spin up, spin down, upgrade, delete, etc., and we will just bring up a new one whenever we need to and bring out whatever that container image needs to be. With a virtual machine, we tend to be a little bit more guarded of that, and we tend to look after that. We tend to treat it more like our pets, and we potentially in the past we might have named it that way. Although I would say that times are changing there as well, in that we should also be thinking about ephemeral virtual machines and how that lives within our infrastructure as well. But then when it really gets interesting is when we start talking not about web servers, which tend to be, if I've got a website and it's quite a static website, I can store all of my data in that container image or in that virtual machine. It very rarely changes, so I don't need to look after it. It doesn't need to get deleted. It doesn't need to be upgraded. It just lives and it just serves its purpose. Where it gets really interesting, though, is when we start looking at databases. Databases, whether they're in Kubernetes or virtual machines, they still carry some important data. The whole reason you have a database is to store an element of data, whatever that data service may be. So that is where that application may become a little bit more stateful, or in the Kubernetes world, we'll call that deployment a stateful set in some regards. So it's not the same, because we're not looking after the complete virtual machine and operating system thereafter, but we are looking after potentially some of that state within that. But they're not the same. And I think that's probably a detailed view on that myth number one. But it's, as much as it is the next wave of platform that we're going to see in our infrastructures, I don't ever see that we're going to be comparing virtualization and containers. It's just another option, like cloud-based workloads are in the big hyperscalers as well as MSPs. It's just another option as a platform.
Nice. Now, if we go to the second myth, a little closer to the space that we live in backup and recovery, second myth is really around, do you need to protect, and maybe take it a bit further, how you need to protect. But talk us through a little bit of sort of the current state of the state as it relates to Kubernetes and backup.
Yeah, so it's really interesting at the moment as well around just data management in general. So when we talk about data management, obviously from a Veeam point of view, we slot into a lot of those bullet points that you see on the screen as well, in terms of backup, replication, application consistency, the ability to migrate, the ability to clone and bring up other versions of that. But really the fundamental part of that is that it could be anything. Data is a lifeblood of a lot of our businesses out there, and it could be anything data related, whether it's big data, databases, unstructured data. It could be the other end, and it could be anything to do with storage. And storage is now vastly looking after different formats as well, in terms of block and file, but also object storage, and then all of the different areas around where you could host those storage. And then you got everything in between, all of the different reasons why that data is being stored, whether it's could just be logging, it could be metrics, it could be around observability, it could be the database that runs your mission critical systems. So we've got all of that covered in there, and it's quite an exciting time because there's a lot of focus on, from a CNCF point of view, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is that around particular areas of storage, whether that be the CSI driver, which gives us a universal container storage interface where storage vendors can write into or plug their APIs into, and then us as a backup vendor, we can leverage those to take snapshots and export those and do whatever we need to do. So it's quite exciting from that point. But another big part of this is that, again, I've kind of said it about, it's the same but a little bit different, that apple and pear type comparison, is that the more familiar and the more advanced this platform is becoming around Kubernetes, more and more people are pushing their stateful workloads, their data services, into Kubernetes. And that's where it starts to get really quite interesting when it comes to protecting that workload. But to roll back a touch, is that the real key part to think about here is that if you think about when we had physical servers, we had an agent that lived on those servers, and we had a central agent management situation where we'd keep the agents up to date. They would caress the operating system and the application maybe, and then allow us to take the backup. Roll on a few years, then we had virtualization. Those agent-based backup vendors, or even solutions out there, took their agent-based solution and moved it into virtualization. Let's say VMware, for example. And each one of those agents were now a massive overhead on those virtual machines, but they had no better way of being able to look after that protection. Then along came a small company called Veeam that actually went, no, that's not the right way to do it. Let's plug into the virtualization API. Let's plug into the vSphere API and be able to take the backup through that API versus having to have an agent and the overhead of all those agents. So in doing that, we lived and breathed that same API, which meant that we were a lot faster. It then opened up the door to be able to recover very quickly into those environments. And then you've seen everything that we're doing today with Veeam and Veeam Backup Replication, being able to really restore your image-based workloads wherever you really need them, whether they're back into whether they're back into VMware or Hyper-V or up into the cloud, but giving you that flexibility because of that starting point where we hooked into the integration API. So then on top of that, sorry, Dave, go on.
Yeah, real quick, we got a couple questions coming in that I want to hit you with. Before I jump on that, though, I do want to do a quick update on the world map, the global map, just to see where we're coming in from. Canada, when these big geographies light up, it's always fun for us. But we see Canada and the United States, we've got Wisconsin, California, New Hampshire, the state of Washington. I'd see if we look over in other parts of the world, we've got, in addition to yourself, we've got Belgium, Slovenia, Albania. I think there's one other portion of the UK that's lit up since we were last over there. I also have India, Kenya, that's come in as well. So many thanks for that. And Mexico, I was mistaken and not highlighting earlier that they've just come in as well. So quick rapid fire, two kind of comments and questions for you, Michael. I believe both are from Joseph. Joseph is just making the point that he's seen more adoption of SaaS, software as a service-based applications or solutions and containerized apps at this point. Protection of containers is valuable, he adds, but it doesn't compare to the adoption in Salesforce, Google Workspace, Microsoft 365. I'll make a comment. I'd love to have you make a comment because that is a popular infrastructure opinion, meaning containers are coming in the future. SaaS-based applications are here today. When we did our survey, our data protection trends report, depending on who you speak to in the organization, meaning the shift left crowd of the app dev DevOps team, containers are in production in about 56% of organizations, with literally the other 44% saying they intend to go into production with containers. So I'm wondering, Michael, if your reaction on this, maybe it's a point in time or maybe it's a function of where you sit in the organization in the data center?
So I think it absolutely does, but I also think it depends on the nature of the data that you're keeping hold of as well. There isn't a SaaS-based product for everything, and should there be potentially? So when it comes to CRM systems such as like Salesforce, would you really want the burden of having to run it yourself, like back in the day, on your own hardware, on your own servers? Probably not. It's much easier. It's a tried and tested future of running Salesforce. Same for Microsoft 365. However, if you're a government service or you're a financial service, do you want to basically hand over the keys to those other SaaS-based services? You might be fine for email. You might be fine for CRM systems, but some of the other data, maybe it's your own application, maybe it's your own data services. There's Unless you develop that SaaS-based workload, then you don't have that option. So I think it depends, and that's not very helpful either because that doesn't help guide where you should be going. But I think it's more interesting that when we see companies like Oracle and Microsoft, obviously they both have SaaS-based products, but they all equally are releasing containerized images of their database systems into Kubernetes or containerized systems. I think that's interesting in that it kind of gives you that flexibility of choice because not everyone is going to want a SaaS-based solution. Some people want a little bit more, because if you think about the as a service type model, and you've got infrastructure as service where you're still in control of everything above the hardware, you just need to control the operating system and above the software and the security of that. Then you get into things like SaaS, and again, you remove yourself from the hardware, the operating system, and even the software to a degree. So now you're just concentrating on the security and the management layers of that. And then you get into other areas like container as a service. So it's how much control you want to give up or are happy to give up, because then that allows you to free up your team and skills to do more things within the business. So that
Yeah, I like
probably
that
doesn't help.
notion because it really harkens back to some Veeam core tenets, which is around flexibility of deployment. Do want to jump in here because I thought this slide was related, this whole shift left that I mentioned a little bit earlier. I think we kind of hit this one right now a little bit about why the DevOps or app dev, whichever phrase you want to use. I sometimes say XOps, meaning any, DevOps, data ops, platform ops, pick your designation of choice. But the next consideration here, maybe take us really quickly through this one here about what are the challenges, and maybe this relates, Michael, to your 90 days of DevOps.
Yeah, massively. And I think this could be a broader term and not just Kubernetes focused. This could be actually virtualization and that adoption of automation or DevOps principles into your virtualization environment as well. But that skills gap is really where what we're seeing at the moment, and that's something that we've tried to help with from a custom point of view with the learning site, and I think we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail later. But to be an infrastructure admin from 5-10 years ago, you're potentially focused on the infrastructure. I want to look after those pets, those virtual machines. Whereas now we should be more focused around the application. And that application looks a little bit different when it's on different platforms. So having that ability to pivot onto that, because not everyone is going to be able to flick a switch and everything goes from infrastructure centric to being application centric overnight. It's going to be a timeline. You're going to be doing that and you've got to have the whole company ethos to be able to do that. But things like being able to look after the automation, but by still having a secure and having the observability of that application, and that will give you the ability to adopt those automation techniques into the operation teams, like day-to-day running, really.
Yeah, and as we get into that, meaning we start to deploy more, scale eventually becomes more and more of a factor. And that's always interesting because if something's going to break, it often breaks at scale or under stress, in other words. So this notion of application scale I thought was interesting. And maybe you could help define polyglot persistence for us.
Yeah, so the easiest way to really define what polyglot persistence is being agnostic to the underpinning infrastructure, whether that's storage, whether it's networking, whether it's compute. So being able to be agnostic to that the underpinning hardware or the underpinning infrastructure. But the explosion in application components is the interesting one here, because we all automatically think, oh, we're now going to have multiple virtual machine type layers that we're going to have to look after. And that's not necessarily the case. What we're doing from a microservices point of view is we're taking each individual service that we might have had running on our virtual machine, and now we're scaling that or pushing that into a container image that allows us to scale that up independently to each other service in the application. So you'll have multiple container images that make up multiple different applications, and they all work together in one big microservice is really the way. So obviously having a platform that gives you the ability to do that, the automation techniques that bring that capability, Kubernetes gives us that application scale. It's built at much bigger scale than what we're seeing at the moment as well. So the future's quite bright in that the scalability of the platform is already far more than what we're already seeing in the research and in the reports that we have today. I think that's kind of interesting, because if we think back to virtualization and VMware, for example, the scalability metrics were, we were always pushing the boundary on a release by release basis. Now we're not getting anywhere close to that when it comes to Kubernetes. So that gives us the ability to grow into that scalability, and that's been there's special interest groups that are already adopting and looking into the future of scalability from a Kubernetes point of view as well.
You know, when you mentioned the S of scalability, it almost cannot have a conversation without mentioning another S, which is security, and feel free to substitute cyber into that. I know Kasten's been doing a number of things. In fact, I should pause just to let everyone know. Michael, Kasten releases K10. That's the product name. Kasten by Veeam. K10 is the product, but releases updates approximately every 2 weeks. Is that correct?
Yeah. So literally have a 2-week sprint where we're focused on bug fixes, but also new features and functionality within the product. And then generally speaking, twice a year we look for a major release, which just coincides to those 2-week releases anyway. But it's where we bump up, and that's where maybe those bigger projects that have been part of many different sprints come into action. And generally that cadence comes around the KubeCon timeframe. So KubeCon EU, which is generally around mid-May, and then KubeCon NA, which is generally the October timeframe. So we see those two big releases from a Kasten K10 point of view around there.
Nice. Yeah. And as we begin to transition, this will be our fifth kind of consideration, and it kind of tees up nicely when we get to talking about the community a little bit. But this notion of ecosystem integration, you know, it strikes me that the shift left crowd, they're very much participating in a broader base, maybe more horizontally, different roles, expanded roles involved as compared to what we may have seen in the initial server-based hypervisor notion. Take us through this one a little bit.
So I'm hoping that a lot of the audience have seen like the CNCF landscape, and at a first glance, it looks massively overwhelming. It is quite overwhelming with all of these different sections all over stating whether it's storage, whether it's monitoring, whether it's security, and so on and so forth, distributions, managed Kubernetes. There's so many different options to that. And it looks quite daunting. But what it does is it allows, at least us from a Kasten point of view, to not reinvent the wheel. Like, we use something called Prometheus to gather our metrics within K10. Prometheus is an open source project adopted by the CNCF landscape, and it's focused on metrics, and then taking those metrics and giving some data visualization on that, pushing it to Grafana. So most recently within K10, with the major release, we're able to push those metrics into a visualization, into a Grafana dashboard. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not having to create our own tool set. We can rely on the community. as well as like databases. A database in Kubernetes, you can think of that exactly what you see in a virtual world or in a managed database as a service, a PaaS type solution. It's still a database. It's still Postgres. There is the same Postgres in a virtual machine within reason. The part there is that we want to be able to protect those as well. So from an ecosystem point of view, yes, we'll leverage the open source and the community driven projects where we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but in return we want to be able to protect those ecosystem projects around data services, databases being listed here, but really any data service, whether it's Kafka, whether it's NoSQL or SQL databases, being able to protect those in the most efficient and consistent way possible. And that's where K10 comes in, really, to protect those in from that side of thing. It's kind of a giving back to the community on that front.
Nice. So speaking of community, let's hit the update on the global map, just looking to see what else is coming. United States, we have the states of Louisiana, Maryland, and Indiana that have come in. Michael, more and more of your cohorts in the United Kingdom are signifying their presence, as well as we've got Germany, Poland, Armenia, and several more in India as well. So I'm going to actually jump to really quickly, as in like just a minute or two, and I know it won't do it justice at all, but maybe Michael, take us through a little bit. You mentioned community. Take us through a couple of the different projects that Kasten has going on with the community.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say as well around our ecosystem is open source software is a big thing. Kubernetes itself is an open source project. So obviously from a K10 point of view, as much as K10 is a proprietary commercial product, it also has a free tier, which is what we've always done at Veeam Software anyway, about giving away free tiers for either technologists, hobbyists to be able to actually look and feel and play with the software. But it's also very important to raise awareness in the open source community as well. So two projects in particular that are a big shout out to us that we've been maintaining. One is Canister, which is an application level data management framework. And this really gives us the functionality to be able to hook into those data services, QoS the workload, and pull out the data and be able to store that in S3 or into different locations. That's the Canister side. K10 also leverages that Canister project. Kubester is more focused around storage. Storage as much as a benchmarking tool within Kubernetes. If you look at the world of Kubernetes and storage, it's massively overwhelming. It goes down to, especially in the managed Kubernetes space, when you're looking at public clouds, it could be determined by the node size that you use for your Kubernetes cluster will determine how many IOPS you get for your storage underpinning that. So Kubester comes along, hits the easy button on that, allows you to identify the Kubernetes storage available to you, validate that it's working or configured correctly, and then benchmark against that. So evaluate that storage and give you how many IOPS is available to that. We've also just released a new bit of functionality in there called Browse, which allows you to actually go and mount that and clone it so you can see inside of the actual persistent volume. Another big one to mention is the learning.kasten.io, which is a learning resource, free learning resource. Exactly what we were talking about is that as this ramp up comes for infrastructure admins, developers, operations teams to get more familiar with what Kubernetes is and how it works, we took it upon ourselves to create this platform that not only allows you to demonstrate and see what K10 does, but also build a Kubernetes cluster from scratch, look at what that storage looks like within the Kubernetes cluster, and everything in between, like start protecting that workload, provisioning that workload, all in an isolated sandbox lab. Have it for as long as you need, build a profile, work through the labs. I think we're up to 5 or 6 labs now, maybe even more. And that's a constant drive that we're bringing in more functionality. And the bottom 3, I'll quickly touch on them. Arcade is a way of deploying K10, as much as we have Helm, we also have Arcade, and then the other two are like sneak peeks into what we're doing in the future. Again, around this open source space, Project Pace is around how quickly can I spin up a Kubernetes cluster with data services with K10 so that I can do a proof of concept for our SEs ourselves, as well as resellers across the globe, but then also just hobbyists wanting to play around with it, not having to understand the underpinning building blocks of Kubernetes at that point, so that we could just use it as a platform. Like today, we don't necessarily need to know the underpinnings of vSphere. We just have to hit next, and we're up and running. That's kind of our Project Pace, and it goes kind of hand in hand with learning.kasten.io, but gives you a local copy of that. And Scoop, I'm not going to touch on that yet. That's a little bit further out, but hopefully we'll have something soon to talk about.
Nice. We'll give everyone the scoop on Scoop when time is right. We're going to drop in this URL as we begin to wrap up, kasten.io/resources. You can see but 3 of them here. These aren't product brochures per se. They're really intended to be educational, informational. 3 of them that we're highlighting here. Be sure to check that out. Do want to give a shout out. This Friday, we won't have a Tech Bites because this Thursday is World Backup Day. And Kirsten and Ksenia from our product strategy team will be doing an event which will be 1 hour earlier than when we came on air today. So depending on where you are in that region. Also want to give a shout out and look ahead to Veeam On, which is coming in May. And if you actually, between now and May 1st, if you register for the in-person portion of that event, it is $400 off, and you can qualify for a chance to win up to 20 pairs of custom Veeam kicks or shoes, which I've got one. See, I got to go the other way. Behind me there. There it is, under the striped Bumblebee guitar. And we will have a number of Kubernetes and Kasten-oriented sessions. You're free to join remotely, virtually, and in person. Love to see some people as we go on our hybrid event series. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out these Kasten resources. I know Brazil came in. Thank you for joining. And we had one question that we didn't get a chance to answer, but we'll drop that in chat. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, stay positive, and be sure to check out World Backup Day on Thursday. Bye for now.